Hi there, it's Nicole here with the Simon Says Stamp STAMPtember 2017 stamp set from Tim Holtz. This is an exclusive for STAMPtember. It's available while supplies last, and it is a stamp set, a cling stamp set with a stencil. And I'm going to be using just the stamp set for two cards here today. The first card is going to feature this winter scene shaker card design using the stamps. So there's kind of the stamp set and the stencil. I'm showing both of them kind of quickly there. And I'm going to move on to creating my background scene, laying out trees and deer from this stamp set. I did speed this part up just a little bit because it's a lot of playing around with the stamps, trying to figure out the best layout for this and working with these images. Then it's going to be a lot of repetition. To create this, I'm using some Canson watercolor paper, and I am stamping the trees with black soot Distress Oxide ink, sprinkling on clear embossing powder, and then heat setting this. I chose to use the black soot Distress Oxide ink because it has pigment ink in it, meaning it is going to stay wet a lot longer than a dye ink. A dye ink would be really tricky to add embossing powder to after you've stamped it because it starts drying almost instantly. This is going to be great because the trees are going to resist the ink I lay on top of this to create my night sky winter scene. You probably would not have to do this if you didn't want to, but I wanted to keep those trees really nice and glossy black and not have the ink kind of fade into the background, I guess. Another option would be to ink up your background. You could do all the masking and things I'm going to show here in a little bit and go ahead and ink up that background, then stamp your trees with a black dye ink instead. And I think you would get really similar results. It's just kind of whatever you feel like doing. I'm going to repeat this a few times, layering the trees to try to get that look of depth and dimension. What's going to provide even more of that depth and dimension that I love so much, especially in a shaker card like this, where everything is relatively flat except for that popped up little frame there, is stamping not only on the inside panel of the card, but what becomes the front window of the card. So I keep using my deer as reference, but they are actually going to be on the front acetate cover of that so that they're never covered up. I punched a circle from some masking paper using a 1 1/4 inch circle punch. If you have a die, a circle die, that would work as well. And that's going to mask off where my moon is going to go, kind of that winter moon. I've also just torn some masking paper and laid it across the bottom to create my landscape of snow. And then I am stamping the stars image. Kind of looks like stars with the combination of falling snow or something. It could be whatever you want it to be. But I am stamping this with Versamark ink and sprinkling on white embossing powder. You could use clear if you want to. What I have found is that this watercolor paper has a bit of a tint to it, and I want my stars to be nice and bright white. That's why I chose to use white embossing powder, but clear would be just fine as well. Once I have all my masking, stamping, embossing done, I'm going to apply Faded Jeans and Black Soot Distress Oxide inks over my background, blending these together until I get a really nice night sky. The stars there are really popping now that you can see them with the resist. And then there's some ink on top of all of these images, so I'm going to buff it off with a dry paper towel, which will really help with all of that. Remove my masks along the bottom, which gives me that great little snow. The moon, which is it's kind of harsh right now, but we are going to fix that here in a little bit. I have got some of this Judikins embossable transparency, which are size to A2 size, which is fantastic for creating a shaker card window. This is also embossable, so if you wanted to emboss on these, this is going to stand up to that. I'm not actually going to do any embossing today, but you could if you wanted to. Using the Misty, and I kept that, the reason it's kind of hard to see through, I want to mention real quick, there are like little packing sheets in between each of the sheets that come in the package, and I left that there for now just in case any ink was still wet on the back of my project so it didn't get on the transparency. But I am stamping then more trees and the deer, and I will stamp the greeting as well on the transparency using black Stazon ink. For this, you are going to have to use an ink that will not smear, and pigment inks and dye inks will never dry on the transparency. They are just going to stay wet, they'll smear. You want to use something like Stazon. I'm going to take two phrases from Tim's stamp set. Winter Wishes from Our Family to Yours is what the greeting's going to read. And I'm going to position those where I want them to go, ink those up again with black Stazon, and stamp those. I think white would have been nice here too. So if you want to mix it up a little bit with all the images kind of in silhouette in black, and you could do a greeting in white, I think that would look really nice. I'm going to take some Starry Colors watercolor now, the white gold and then probably a little champagne, and I'm going to wet the circle first and kind of go around this with my water brush pen and pick up a little bit of that Distress Oxide ink. It's going to lightly color and distort those edges to make it maybe not quite so harsh. Don't want to get too crazy with this, but just soften the edges a little bit. The white gold is going to give some nice sparkle and shine. That champagne color is going to add a nice little touch of gold to this. I don't want to add a ton of color, but I want my moon to have some texture. Then I'm going to take a heat tool and heat this. I like to let it sit and air dry a lot of times, or if at all possible, but I wanted to get on making my shaker, so I'm going to heat this with my heat tool to speed up drying time. Once this is good and dry, I'm ready to start putting it all together. So here is my transparency layer and the background. I need to die cut the background first. I did the whole panel to begin with because I really love the look of the frame matching the inside of the card, so it's a continuous scene. At this point, as I was getting ready to die cut the frame, I thought I really needed a couple more trees. So I am going to go ahead and stamp a couple more before I do the die cutting. This is always a great time to reevaluate your project. Make sure that you have everything you need. Make sure that it looks good before you start on those finishing pieces. Once you put foam adhesive down anywhere on any type of a card, but in this case it's going to be around the frame for the shaker, it doesn't give you a very flat surface at all to stamp on. I die cut the second largest Simon Says Stamp stitched rectangle frame right there from the center, and I'll be using both the frame and the inside panel. I'm going to use the frame as a guide on a top fold white card base to replace that inside panel piece. Line it up perfectly. Go ahead and pop that out now. And there's the background of my scene. On the back of the frame, I'm going to go around all four edges with a nice strong adhesive and place the transparency right behind this. And it was slightly longer than my panel, so I'm just going to trim off that little bit along the bottom edge. Then when I lay the transparency over, you can see how that frame is going to look. I just love this. I'm going to double up some foam adhesive now and then trim it in half. It's pretty much the same width as my frame, but just in case it's a little bit too big, I think it's going to be better to trim it in half. Plus, this automatically doubles the amount of foam adhesive I have. I'm going to frame up on the card base. So I'm going to go around that middle panel for my card instead of taking it to the back of the frame. And I'm doing this because I think it's going to be a lot easier to line up the front of the frame with the card base rather than taking the card base to the frame, if that makes sense. So I can just set the top of my shaker frame right on top and make sure it's lined up perfectly and don't accidentally get it skewed. I'm making sure my foam adhesive is right next to each other, and then I'm going to go around all of the inside areas of that foam adhesive with a powder tool to help keep my cling products from sticking. I did fill it with some Honeybee Stamps Ice Chips glitter and Lawn Fawn Prisma glitter. Not a lot of Prisma glitter, just a couple of tiny little taps for that iridescent sparkly shine, and the rest is that awesome Honeybee Stamps Ice Chips glitter. It's a little bit chunkier and it looks fantastic. I'll remove the backing paper from all 4 sides of the foam adhesive and replace the frame. And there is my awesome winter shaker scene. You can shake up the snow, almost kind of like a snow globe effect where the snow is falling down in this winter scene. Now the one deer is in profile, and I thought it would be fun to take some Nuvo crystal drops in autumn red and add a little red nose to make that Rudolph. So very teeny tiny, but perfect little accent. The next card I'm going to create is more of a woodland theme, I guess I want to say, where I have these tree rings stamped repeatedly all over to form a background, another deer, and then some greetings stamped and embossed on strips underneath. To start, I'm going to create this tree rings background. I love this stamp. I think that the tree rings are really eye-catching. So I'm going to go ahead and start in one corner and work my way out and down, filling in the entire surface of this craft cardstock. This is some Nina Desert Storm craft cardstock. And I'm using Vintage Photo Distress Oxide ink to stamp these rings all over. Getting them as close to one another as I can, and making sure and filling in every little nook and cranny all over the surface of this background. Once I have that done, I'm going to take an ink blending tool and blend in the edges of the panel, I'm going to go lightly over the entire surface of this piece of cardstock, but I'm going to concentrate the ink in the center of the tree rings. I don't want to go too dark because I don't want to distort the design of the stamped image too much or blend it out where you can't see it, but I want to add the majority of the color to the tree rings themselves. So I concentrated the ink there, and then I'm going to go very lightly over the rest of the design to blend out that color and add some really fun interest to the background. So all of this was created with one image and a little bit of ink, one ink pad for the stamping and the blending. So much fun. I really love this image. Once I have this all blended out the way I want it to look, I want to add a little distressing to the background. A very little bit of distressing. It's not going to be overpowering. This is a much simpler design. This is a very clean and simple style of card, really, even though there's stamping and inking and things. I'm going to take a little bit of the Picket Fence white paint. I'm going to put a little bit in the palette here. Add some water to this to water it down, which makes it much easier to flick over the surface of something. Pick it up with a small paintbrush and just flick little drops of this all over the surface of my background. Then I let this sit and air dry. It probably ended up being an hour. I had other things I was doing, so I let it sit and dry. Then I'm going to figure out my placement for the deer. Again, I want to use the deer in profile so I can add some of those Nuvo crystal drops for the nose. I'm going to ink up the image with the black SOOT Distress Oxide ink. The background does need to be very good and dry because I used Distress Oxide ink on the background. If it is not dry, the embossing powder I use for the deer will stick to anything in the background. So make sure that the background's dry. If you need to, hit it with a heat tool. Then I'm going to sprinkle on clear embossing powder and heat set that deer. It's going to make the deer nice and glossy and really stand out against the stamped background. I love how it looks when it's all embossed. So there is the deer. And then I'm going to take some red cardstock and, first, pardon me, I am going to trim down this panel. I wanted it to be about 1/4 of an inch smaller than the top fold card base that I'm using. In order to do this, I'm cutting about 1/8 of an inch off of all 4 sides. I had already centered the deer kind of where I wanted it to go, so I trimmed up all 1/8 of an inch off all 4 sides, and that's going to make it just a little bit smaller, but that's going to be perfect so that when I adhere this to the top fold card base, it has a white mat all the way around. I'm going to take all 3 phrases I'm using from the STAMPtember stamp set and lay them out, pick them up with the MISTI, using a powder cling tool on some chili pepper Lawn Fawn cardstock, and I'm going to stamp these with Versamark ink. Make sure that I get them stamped really well. I inked them up and stamped them twice just to make sure that I had really good stamped impressions. And I think my Versamark ink pad is getting a little dry. I'm sure I need another one, or I need to re-ink it. I'll sprinkle on white embossing powder. I love the look of the white embossing on the red cardstock. The red cardstock's really going to give it a great pop of color and give it that kind of holiday feel, that rustic. Rustic is the word I was looking for, that rustic holiday feel. I'm going to use some score tape on the back of each of these strips and adhere them right underneath my deer. The strips are kind of thin, and I didn't really have a tape runner that was thin enough to use. Score tape is fantastic and it's super sticky. So it's going to pretty much stay put wherever you put it. All 3 of these are going to be attached with some score tape. And I'm attaching them at angles. Helps give it a little bit more of that whimsical type feel, I guess. I love these greetings. They're fantastic. The font for these is really great. Once I have that, I'm going to take that Nuvo Crystal Drops in Autumn Red again and add just a tiny little dot for the nose. Place this on a white top fold card base, and that is going to finish up the rustic style card featuring Tim Holtz's STAMPtember 2017 stamp set. The supplies I used to create these cards are listed and linked below the video here on YouTube. Here are a couple more videos featuring Christmas stamps and dies that you might be interested in. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.